This is an audio-only recording of Baltimore Racial Justice Action's in-person November 2024 13th of the month event, looking forward from the 2024 election. This discussion, moderated by BRJA's Julia Scott, was joined by Charly Carter, Andy Ellis, and Lawrence Grandpre. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Is down with us. The Saku crew, you know they down with us.
Good evening. My name is Lawrence Grandpre. I am Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We go by our initial LDS. We're a grassroots think tank. We've operated in Baltimore for 15 years. We operate in the position or the concept of community self-determination inspired by traditions of Black nationalism and pan-African liberation. So we look in Baltimore for examples like Walter Carter, Karen Mitchell, Jill Carter, folks like that have inspired our work on a variety of issues, from police accountability to giving resources to grassroots organizations. We do a variety of work, youth work with the Baltimore City Children's Youth Fund. Just today was the swearing in of the Baltimore City Community Repair Reparations Commission, which will have control over the tax revenue from recreational cannabis taxation and be commissioned and have the power to direct those funds to communities impacted by the war on drugs for programming reparative of the harm of mass incarceration from cannabis prohibition. So we work on a variety of issues. I've worked a lot on drug policy. So of course we have the opioid settlements, over $600 million, and making sure that money can be invested in grassroots organizations as well. So things like that, what we do. Yeah.
Hi everybody, I'm Charly Carter. I am a advocate, longtime advocate here in Baltimore, and I run an organization called Step Up Maryland, which is a civics, literacy, and leadership, public leadership development organization with a goal of reconnecting people with the functions of government and owning their power, helping citizens learn how the government works and where they have power and how they can influence the process and change systems. It comes out of the work that we do is everything from workshops for the community to training boards and commissions, public boards and commissions members to act as insider advocates for moving and making systems change. And we also, one of the things I'm really passionate about is building a new political culture where our elected leaders are partners with the electorate instead of, usurping the power of the people. And we do that by training newly elected leaders to act in a different way and to be more accountable to people.
Great, thank you. My name is Andy Ellis. I'm a 2018 graduate of Charly's Step Up training. I took that as a Green Party candidate for state delegate in 2018. I wasn't a newly elected leader, but I wanted to learn what Charly had to teach. I was a member of the Charter Commission this year in Baltimore City, where we reviewed the charter, including question H, question G, some of these other questions that we saw on Election Day. I'm most recently the chair of Baltimore for Democracy, which was a ballot issue committee that was part of the coalition that worked to defeat question H, and we used a lot of the skills that Charly taught in that process. We worked with Lawrence and LBS in that process as well. And I'm a 2026 candidate for governor of the state of Maryland as a Green Party candidate. So I'm excited to get to have this discussion tonight, and I'm excited to see everybody here.
Awesome. So I want to thank you all for once again being here. We had a lot of ideas about how this conversation would go in consideration of the recent election. We wanted to make sure we were keeping this open. We knew that a lot of people have a lot of emotions about the outcome of that election and what does this mean for politics going forward, particularly I think in Baltimore. What does it mean for Maryland, right? What does it mean for a lot of our entities and institutions that we work with or benefit or have access to? So I want to pose first to, actually before that, let's all take a deep breath. Because I know that I've been doom scrolling and looking at news, and it's always like new things coming up, and I'm just like, I don't know what's happening. And so I've been in a very off-center feeling, so I'm sure other folks have too. So taking a deep breath is definitely warranted and needed. But yes, I wanted to ask you all first, with the outcome of this election, what do you all think this actually means for Baltimoreans going forward in our politics? I know with Step Up Maryland, we talk about informing folks about what does it mean to talk to your politicians, to push, advocate for themselves. But I mean, I have no problem with mincing words. But I think that Donald Trump is an authoritarian, and usually that's not a good thing. So, what does that mean going forward for our politics?
Well, ironically, our plan hasn't changed. Whether Kamala won or Trump won, our plan was to re-engage people after the election. Democracy. We have gotten into this culture where people think the election is democracy. I go, I vote, I did my job, hands off, and that is how we get, the disconnection, dissatisfaction. I think our plan hasn't changed. We're still focused on engaging people because we have to fight. Even if it was, and the other, if Kamala Harris had won, we would still need to fight for the things that we want, because the people who have power in this country, they are still prioritizing their interests over the interests of the people. So if we as the people want change, we still have to fight for it, no matter who's at the top of the structure. I think for Baltimore, the outcome of the election means many things. Baltimore stood to really benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act. I believe one of the actions that this incoming president will do will be to try to dismantle that law, which means money that the city had been depending on to eliminate lead poisoning, which would help tens of thousands of families in this city, as well as our schools. That money is gone. The work on making sure that our air is clean, those are all things that we're going to have to work about. I think that we spent the last 8 years, listening to what an S-hole city Baltimore City was. Mm-hmm. I cannot believe that was just words. I think Baltimore is close enough to DC that they will want to make an example of us. So I think that we will look at a whole lot of federal engagement, particularly in law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And so I think for us, this really is a moment where we don't have the opportunity or the luxury to sit back, that we have to organize. We have to push President Biden to accelerate expenditures and get money out the door so that we can get it before Trump gets in office. And I also think that we need to hold our leaders, make sure that we are reinforcing our leaders so that they don't feel like they're being pressured to do the things that we as a community don't want.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I've told people a lot of folks have been saying Maryland is blue. So, we have that doesn't necessarily mean anything. I think that it's a false sense of safety. And so I think definitely organizing, educating, and pushing our leaders. And you're right, us being so close to DC means that we will be made an example. We already see what they do to Chicago, and we've also been on that list. So that's important. I wanted to ask Lawrence, with the work that you do with LDS, how are you all like talking about what's been happening since the election? Okay.
So I think it's important to think about, from our perspective, Black folks, we've been a captive electorate of the Democratic Party since the shift towards the Democrats that sort of solidified with Kennedy and Johnson after the Civil Rights Act. And I think with that, the Democratic Party has become experts at maximizing the fear and rhetoric around abandonment of Black people if Democrats lose, while minimizing redistribution to Black people that in any way would anger its elite donor base. So what we saw with this election is that stopped working in a severe way. One of the biggest reasons Kamala lost was not that there was this huge turnout for Trump. It was high turnout. He got more votes than last time, but not by much. It was a turnout collapse to the Democrats by about 7 million votes that in places like Philadelphia, Milwaukee, places where they have bombarded Black folks with, even Flint. Trump won Flint. So when you think, how is that possible? So when I studied the analysis of the lead pipes, I believe looking at the bill, it's actually a loan. So it's a loan fund that they actually have access to, but they have to pay back the loan to change out those lead pipes. Additionally, and this surprised me when I saw it, the number one vector of lead poisoning for Black folks isn't actually lead in the water. It's lead paint in housing. So what would it have looked like to have Black folks organize grassroots funding from the government to build new housing, good housing, genuinely affordable housing, and strip the lead out of the houses we have? There is no constituency within the Democratic Party that stands to benefit from that. In fact, the real estate constituency stands to lose from that, while we might embrace them, the pipe fitters unions stand to benefit from a massive multi-billion-dollar investment in new pipes. That's not to say that's not important. What it is to say is that we are emotionally manipulated into accepting frames for solutions to our problems that are beneficial to core constituencies in the Democratic Party that are not us. And when I say us, I mean working class Black folks, right? So what we see is working class Black folks saying, I hear you, I see you, but this isn't working anymore. And the solutions you offer do not operate at the scale of the violence that has been done to me historically. So when we talk about the election, what we talk about is actually shifting the Democratic Party towards understanding that the violence we will see from Trump is real and it's different, but it's not entirely unique from the violence done by Democrats. So what we're going to see from Trump is the targeting of local Black elected officials. Last time he was in power, if you remember, Nat Oaks, Cheryl Glenn, Pew to a certain extent. Not to say these folks were inherently innocent or that we can't hold politicians accountable when they do wrongness, but there is an industry of targeting Black elected officials, and a lot of folks on the left ignore it because we've internalized notions that, well, local politics is inherently corrupt. Because we don't have access to seeing the possibilities of operationalizing power locally. Because it's definitely impure, and it's definitely complicated when things like that happen, because the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, son of Chokwe Lumumba, who was one of Assad Shakur's lawyers, he just got indicted by the Biden administration. So that's what I mean. It is going to be an increase in acceleration of violence, but it's not unique violence. And what we have to do is we have to fight, build the power locally, and get over our anxieties as leftists and progressives around wielding power to secure our communities from violence, not from Republicans, but from the violence of the institutional forces of white supremacy and capitalism.
Wow, thank you. You can sit with that for a minute. Yeah, that was a whole word. Absolutely. I think, I think I was just online, as I told you all, I do scroll. And I saw, of course, like President-elect Trump going to the White House, and Biden was like, oh, welcome back. And I was like, for all of the violence that we know this person is capable of, that he's been talking about for the last 4 years, there's a very specific kind of spinelessness that I feel is on display in action when I see kind of like the Democrats like engaging with this. So I think that definitely a lot of people I saw were kind of saying like, well, both of these parties are the same. I know that people, even myself, like that was something that I was grappling with throughout this whole election, was that obviously like I didn't want Trump to win. And Kamala was not my choice either. She's not my favorite. And what do you do when you're kind of with the lesser of two evils, when it's very clear that both are doing like very evil things? And so I do think that a lot of people were just like, well, I'm not making a choice, right? I'm not going to do it. So for Andy, I want to kind of follow up with you. And we talked about this, I think, even like in our discussion about this event, with if Trump was to win, a lot of people, and I've already seen it online, we're going to call out third parties. They were going to say, this is because of the third party candidates, because of Jill Stein. If you all had just done this, she would be in office. Like that was going to be kind of the argument. And it seems that there's a lot of discussion about what should have happened, but the third party like discussion, I think, is something. So I wanted to kind of give you a chance to speak about that.
Yeah, so the third party story in this election is not about the Green Party. The third party story in this election is that while Kamala Harris was attacking her third party critics, Donald Trump was absorbing his third party critics. So for the whole month of August and September, while they were running attack ads and while elected Democratic officials were going after the Green Party, that worked. That got those people to not vote for Jill Stein. But what it didn't do is get them to vote for Kamala Harris. While that was happening, Donald Trump was bringing in a bunch of angry young men who liked RFK Jr. into his fold and into his realm. And his approach to this was not to attack his critics, was to bring them into his electoral coalition. So what you see happening is Donald Trump replaced people who left his electoral coalition from 2020 or 2016 because they thought that he was crazy, and he brought another crazy person's people into his electoral coalition, which is going to make it even more dangerous. So we can't even imagine what it would look like for the Democratic Party to have done the same move to the Green Party. They could have said, yeah, let's offer a ceasefire. Yeah, let's offer an immediate cease to arms sales to Israel. Yeah, let's talk about socialized medicine. Yeah, let's talk about free college for all. If they had done those things and they had made the same gestures that Donald Trump made, then we might have seen a different election. But that's not the world we live in, and we can't imagine a Democratic Party that would have made that move. And it certainly wouldn't have been Kamala Harris. So the third party story in this election is not Jill Stein, it is not Cornel West, it is not Claudia de la Cruz. It is that Donald Trump was a better politician. He brought his critics into the fold, made his coalition more dangerous, more loaded with young white men who are angry at the system. And now we all have to deal with that. So I think like Charlie and Lawrence, our strategy doesn't change either. For good or for bad, I learned about fascism from George Jackson when I was 24. And I understand that it is a system that is all around us. It is not a matter of which party wins in any given election. There may be different ways that it gets executed. And it's going to be bad in Maryland. Federal jobs are going to get cut. Trump is not going to have some fancy algorithm when he decides which federal jobs to cut. He's going to say, are you a Democrat who lives in Maryland? You get cut. Are you a Republican who lives in Virginia? You're good. It's going to be that simple. And our economy is based on a lot of those federal jobs. So it's going to be pretty bad. It's going to be pretty bad here in Maryland. He's going to come after our immigrants. He's going to make an example of Maryland because we're right next door. So we need to get ready to build the local power in order to resist that. And I think we need, as Lawrence says, we need to be able to wield that power in order to demand that our Democratic supermajority in Annapolis is protecting immigrants, is taxing the wealthy and making sure that they're paying folks what they need to, that they're not moving to the right on crime, that they're not moving to the right on a whole bunch of issues, because that's going to be their instinct. They're going to look at this election, and Wes Moore, who is already doing that quite a bit, is going to move to the right on those issues, just like he did with juvenile crime last year. He's going to keep doing that. And so we need to build, it doesn't matter what party you're in, we need to build together in order to stand up to this and wield the power we have to make them do what they can do so that, so that Maryland doesn't bear the worst brunt of it.
Absolutely, yeah. First, I forgot all about Cornel West running. So when you said his name, I was like, ooh, what? But yes, I forgot. He did also run. And yes, like, that has been another huge conversation amongst the, why did he win? How did he pull this off? What is going on in the world? The other part of this has been, the fear, and we're already kind of seeing the shape of moving Democrats right. It's like, I've been saying to a lot of people, well, they've kind of been flirting with that for decades. So what does that mean going forward? I already see, especially as someone who works in diversity, equity, inclusion work, and anti-racism work, we already see people like, oh, we need to leave woke stuff alone. We need to leave these things. It's like, well, I have a lot of thoughts on that we can get into, but that is we already see that kind of happening. So what does that actually mean? But I really want to really talk about something that you kind of brought up, Charlie, was like the kind of what we think political things are. What do we think about being political people? And that means just voting, right? It's like, and so that is kind of the extent to how we think of ourselves as political citizens. We go in the booth, we vote, and then, every 2 or 4 years, and then it's like, okay, we're done. Which obviously I think is something that's been harmful. So I want to talk about a little bit of like the kind of emotional relationship that we have with politics. Like, I know with Kamala, even with Trump, you brought up like the young white men who are like angry. There's a lot of emotional kind of relationships with these political parties, with candidates. I know as a Black woman in Kamala, but that was like a big part of kind of, I think, the mobilization of her. How do we begin to unpack that relationship, and how do we turn that relationship?
Is that directed to me?
Yeah, all of
Okay.
it. I'm starting with you, yes.
All right. Well, the first thing is, I think that it's not just an emotional relationship with politics. I think we have to examine our relationship with power. And Lawrence brought this up. Like, on the left, power is considered a bad thing, right? We run from it. It's got this dark, it's power. There is nothing like power is no more good nor evil than air. It exists. And we have to start talking about power the same way we should talk about money, right? Because when there are secrets and there are things that we don't talk about, then some of us just sort of like go to sleep and, think it's a bad thing. And while those of us who understand it harness it really well. One thing I'm going to say is, if there's one takeaway from this election, it is that the right understands power. They understand how to use power. And the people, not even the leaders, the people understand that they have power, right? We saw countless critics or never Trumpers kiss the ring when they realized like their careers might, or their seats might be on the line. And so, but on the left also has that level of power. We just don't exercise it. It's not happenstance that people feel like I've done my civic duty once I voted. It's because we have developed a culture that says, I got this. You elected me, now I'll take care of it, right? And people have gotten, we have a lot of stuff going on in our lives where people are working 2-3 jobs sometimes. We're worried about our families. We're taking care of our parents. We have a lot going on. Some people are watching the Housewives of Orange County. I don't know. But we have a culture, and Democrats to a large part have fostered this, that I got you. You elected me, I'll take care of it. But that's not how it works, right? Even when Barack Obama was running for re-election, he said, make me do the things that you want me to do. And I think we have to re-educate people about power, what it looks like, how it's theirs. It's not, that elected leaders. Every class I teach, I start with saying, when you walk into an election booth on election day, you walk into a voting booth, it's like handing somebody your credit card and saying, use it in case of emergency, right? You are lending it, and you are asking them to use it responsibly. It's not their card. You're not giving it to them to go out and go have, 300-year-old scotch, right? You are telling, if you have an emergency, use it. But at the end of those 4 years, it's still your card. During those 4 years, it's still your card. And at any time, you can say, no, I want you using it this way and not that way. We have to have that, teach people that it's their power. And then we have to teach people how to have conversations with their elected leaders to hold their elected leaders accountable. But we also have to organize, and now is a perfect time when people are mad and they're fearful, not just to rise up and offer resistance, but to rise up and organize and come up with their vision for what they want to happen, for their priorities, and then pressure their leaders to follow those priorities.
Absolutely.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I think, yesterday when I saw the headline that Trump wanted to seize endowments in order to pay reparations to white people for DE&I policies.
Y'all win again.
Yeah, I mean, so it reminded me of this conversation that I had in the spring with a guy named Devarian Baldwin. And Devarian Baldwin wrote a book called In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower. And then In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower is talking about the way that big universities like Hopkins and Yale and other big urban universities like that have taken over the cities that they're in, and have taken over the government, have taken over the tax base, and have become the company of the new company town. And he tells a story about in New Haven, Connecticut, where they decided during the first parts of the pandemic, everybody decided to band together in order to force Yale to pay the taxes that they owed, to pay useful benefits to people, to offer health care, to offer housing, and to do these things. And they bound together in order to force Yale to give out way bigger pilot payments than Yale had ever wanted to do. Now, if we look here in Baltimore, we have surrendered our power to Johns Hopkins University, and we refuse to tell them that they need to pay their fair share. They have world-class health care sitting in the middle of East Baltimore in one of the poorest and least healthy communities in the country, and that is because we have not used the power in order to make them do what their nonprofit mission says they have to do, right? They're providing tons of housing across the city, but they're not providing it to people in Baltimore who need it. And that's because we have surrendered our power to them while we just let them sit there. The right has a plan. They understand what their vision of the university is. They want to strip the power out of it. They want to make it stop doing what it's doing right now. They want to punish it for for fostering free speech and fostering justice. The right has a plan for it, and the left has lacked a plan for it for the really long time. We are moving into a period of time where if the left lacks plans for things, and the people who are in community trying to build power lack plans, we're going to get run over by the Trump administration, by the right, and by all of the sycophants that he's putting into power today. So, I just, when that came up yesterday, it reminded me of Devarian Baldwin saying, look, the right has had a plan for universities for a very long time. They know why they don't like them, and they know what they want to do with them. And the left needs to start having that kind of strategic thinking to figure out how to harness the power and wealth that those universities have and direct them back toward the people upon whose communities they're built on and built in. And I thought that was a really good example of the way that we need to think about things as we're going into this time. Like, we can't be afraid to use the power to do the things that we know are right. I saw a bunch of people's heads nodding when I was saying that Hopkins was this, that, and the other. We all know the problem. We need to band together and force them to do the things that we know they need to do in order to bring equality and equity to our communities.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to also have you, Lawrence, talk about another really kind of talk about this in the planning.
Mm-hmm.
Also about like the trauma and fear of confronting power, right? Because all of that is like amazing. And it's like I'm always like yes, and then it's like, well, how? And like wait, like I'm black, and and I'm afraid, and like the fear of the target that puts on our backs, right? So, and then as you mentioned, all the stuff that you have like in life. So, how do you actually deal with that, the fear and the trauma of that?
Yeah, so how do I explain this? So Americans have been subject to, at this point, a 75-year intentional counterinsurgency in terms of trying to convince us to understand theories of power that fundamentally benefit those that have power. So if you look at the work of someone like Francis Stoney Sanders, The Cultural Cold War, White Money, Black Power by Naomi Brooks, even our understanding from the academy about power is locked into a very individualistic frame where personal expression and personal freedom becomes the context of what liberation means. Now, that feels good, that sounds good, when you're talking about collective oppression and the need to redistribute trillions of dollars in resources. there's going to be a tension between individual freedom and collective policy. Now, on the left, that manifests itself where if your policy in any way conflicts with my personal freedom, then it's not that we have to hash it out, you become an enemy to me. And on top of that, things like counterintelligence program, there's been conditioning through violence. And again, it's not to blame the victim. It's been conditioning through violence, even with the Red Scare, that if you claim power for yourself, you'll be a target of state violence, but also face ostracism from the institutions that can keep you employed. So it becomes something that, again, the left does not talk about money. The left does not talk about the incentives of how to make a living that impact your ability to say what you can say and what you can't say. And so all of this puts us in the position where folks feel they have to adopt theories that, again, adopt maximal acceptance and focus on an individualistic cultural frame, but don't actually engage the complexity of things at a communal level. I think an example of this is drug policy. So one thing that's going to happen is Trump is going to cut money for harm reduction. There's very little money at a federal level for harm reduction, but it's probably going to get cut. So I think this became clear to me in my studies and my work that there is a version of the left that is very much pro-experimentation, pro-freedom, pro-drug use, right? And that is a part of the movement that has attached itself in some ways to the harm reduction movement. So harm reduction has called itself part of a larger social movement for justice. But what people don't see them showing up on housing policy, don't see them showing up on policing, don't see them showing up when it's time to redistribute resources in a complex way, it feels like they're just trying to keep their friends who want to experiment with drugs alive. And so when people are visibly homeless, suffering through addiction, and the best we can do is say, here's your clean needles, that sets up the right wing to blame harm reduction for that. They're right that it's a housing capitalism problem. But when people don't see them actively engaging in housing and capitalism, they don't have a ton of ground to stand on for people to hear that argument. So, Oregon decriminalized drugs in 2020, recriminalized drugs last year, right? Because the left did not have the ability to engage in a comprehensive investment in community institutions to build them up and to make the argument as to why they should stick with that policy. So right now, we have a $600 million settlement from opioid manufacturers. We are going to be more than able to compensate for any federal money cut from Trump. But the question is, are we going to allow Johns Hopkins University, who the czar who's been appointed is from Hopkins? And what they know is public health. What they know is methadone, Suboxone, needles. Effectively, those are bad. But when the community sees the comprehensive hollowing out from the war on drugs, they see people cycling in and out of jail, and they say, where's the housing for them? Where's the housing for the victims of the war on drugs? What about our anxiety about the ways that crack was flooded into our communities during the 80s to disrupt our communities? What about the fact that internalized trauma from racism, part of what people are doing is they're escaping from that by drug use. That may not be liberatory for us in the same way as it is for you. So these are questions that the left has a very hard time hearing any other way than you don't like me, or you're not my friend, or you saying that will make it hard for me to get tenure, so I have to disassociate from you. So there are all these unspoken realities, or even, that sounds good, I know my funders not going to cover that for my grant, so I got to stick with my grant cover. There are all these unspoken limitations in the structure of how the left has built itself, theorized itself, and talked about itself that limited our ability to comprehensively address the problems we claim to address. People sense that. And now they're going to turn to the right, or the left is going to have to build comprehensively and study the art and science of actually building power to address problems comprehensively, to stop people from that rightward drift.
Okay, I mean, I think that what you all are, for one, saying is like, this is messy. And I think, I mean, that's kind of a very simple way of summing some of this up, but like, it's messy work. It's not like, it's not black and white. It's extremely nuanced. And once you think you know something, you actually realize that you don't know anything. And I think that even in my own kind of growth in my own political education, and I'm sure for others they kind of deal with this as well, it is something that it's tiring. Like, caring about stuff is tiring. As someone who does like anti-racism work, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, and I love it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired. Like, because you are mentally, physically in this kind of space constantly with people, and you realize that like it is never ending, right? Like it feels and it is never ending. And so I just wonder, because I think this is something that I've heard a lot about recently. I want to kind of shift a little bit to the identity politics part of the conversation, because that is a huge part, right? Like, one of the things that you're talking about in these kind of spaces is the fact that, like, you have groups of people who are, for example, Black. You have folks who are from other backgrounds, and while there are some very similar experiences that we have, our relationship to power and power structures are different. And so, for example, I'm sure people have seen people say, like, well, Black women are done. They're like, I'm done. I've been doing all this work. I've been trying to, make sure that this country, as much as I can, does what it's supposed to do. And y'all didn't show up. And so I'm done. I'm on vacation for the next 4 years. Like, you do what you want to do. And it's like, on one end, like, I remember, Tuesday night, I was there. I was like, yeah, I'm tired. I'm done. And then, like, over the weekend, after a few drinks, I was like, well, that's just not the work, right? It's like, the work is, like, this is what I signed up for, unfortunately. I signed up to keep going. And as you said, it doesn't just stop at the voting booth. So how does identity politics, kind of influence what we're seeing? How does that shape our work going forward? And how can we continue? Because, look, obviously as BRJA, we do a lot of work around anti-oppression. Like, that is a part of our work. That has to be called, that has to be discussed. And I think that, I know that people are tired of discussing it, but very easily you can look at, this in the last week's election, and you can see that was also a part of the discussion, right? It's like, I see a lot of folks on TV. My dad happens to be an MSNBC fan, so I've a lot of, MSNBC, and you see people and they're like, well, we're done talking about this. That's what made us lose. And I was like, I don't think that's what it is. So how do we make sure that as we're kind of engaging with these conversations around power, that discussions around race, which is also about power, discussions around, class, which is also about power, how do we make sure that those things are also still at the forefront as we're kind of trying to be a collective? And anyone can answer that question.
I'll start. I think that the 2024 version of the Democratic Party has drifted away from the original conception of identity politics in a pretty significant way. An intersectional identity politics that recognizes the class aspects of what's going on, the race aspects of what's going on, and the way that those all combine in order to create a person's identity was a good idea when the Combahee River Collective came up with it years ago. Now it has become stripped of its materiality. In many ways, it is not a politics that is rooted in a class analysis anymore. That doesn't mean that Kamala Harris would not have been better for working class and middle class folks, but it means that the analysis and the messaging is not connecting around that, and it is not appreciating the intersectional nature of those things. And I think as the Democratic Party has drifted into that direction, it has lost a lot of its ability to mobilize the people they rely on for their base, who are both working class and Black. They're not simply Black folks, they're not simply working class, they're intersectional. And at the same time, I don't think that is what cost the Democratic Party this election. I think that white supremacy was really powerful and really strong, and it spoke to a lot of white folks who were mobilized by it, and the 2024 version of identity politics didn't speak to as many Black and Latino and other folks as it once did. So it's not that the white supremacy is the story of the election. It is the story of this election, it's the story of the last election, and it's the story of the elections all before that, right? It is the story of the country, and it is the story of how we do things, and I don't think, while I think it is important to understand the way that the Democratic Party has started to drift away from some of the messaging of like Fannie Lou Hamer and their base at a different time, we can't allow that to overwhelm the way that Trump used white supremacy incredibly effectively in order to mobilize the people he needed to win. And to me, that is an incredibly important part of the story that I don't want to I think it's important to say, here are where the Democratic Party could do better on these questions, but I also think it's important to say, here's what Trump did extraordinarily well, and it was mobilize white supremacy and white resentment in order to get people to vote for him, while Harris was not able to turn out the parts of her base that she would have relied on in order to win.
Yes, and I think that, again, it comes back to a conversation about power. And when we talk about intersectionality, regardless of what people's identities are, they tend to show up as the one that gives them the most power. So even if we're talking about within the left, the movement of the left, whether we're calling it the party or not, you have dynamics of white supremacy that we need to deal with, right? I think Dana Vickers-Shelley said it. It is the foul soup we all swim in, right? And I think that there are, within the movement of the left, there's striations, right? There are power dynamics that we need to talk about. We just need to talk about it. Because those with power put their agenda above. And oftentimes that leaves the base, and when I say the base, I'm largely saying Black voters, sort of trailing and picking up whatever tailings are left over. We need to have that conversation. And to be frank, this is a conversation I've been having at the national level since 2021, when the left was pushing Biden to pass, the climate, to pass the PRO Act, to pass infrastructure, instead of focusing on protecting the rights of Black voters so that they could get reelected and that we could get a Congress that could pass the kind of legislation that people wanted. That example is why Black people, Black voters are so disconnected from the movement and the party. It is because there is a fundamental lack of self-analysis at how people with power are advancing their agenda without looking at how you use power, right? What is the first law of power? It is to hang on to it at all costs. So if the left was really serious about having power and owning power for the movement, they would say, what is it that I need to do, not for my legacy, but what is it that I need to do so that I can hang on to the power that I have and make sure that the other side doesn't get it. Donald Trump, very clear. I'm suspending the Constitution on the first day, or whatever, to whatever extent that I can do that. He is very clear about what power looks like, and very clear, I'm going after my enemies. Very clear, I'm going after endowments. Very clear on how to use power. And as a product of the movement on the left, we have to be as ruthless when we think about power. If we believe our vision of the world is the right vision, we have to be willing to have difficult conversations and be bold, audacious, and use power the way power is meant to be used, right? Which means we got power, we make sure we build on that power. And when we look at when the movement on the left, when we looks at where their power is, it is deeply rooted in Black and brown people. Lawrence was right. The reason Lawrence was right, there were far fewer Black people who turned out to vote. It is because the party did not seek out those people. It is not just about people gave up. It is that decisions were made strategically on where to place their emphasis, and that was, we want to go after white men to bring them back into our fold, as opposed to let's go where we know where we can catch fish, right? Like, I can't catch fish in the desert, but if I go to the ocean, I freaking know I can catch fish. I'm buying a boat and some nets. If I'm serious about winning, I'm not gonna go, land cruising somewhere in the dune surfing in the Kalahari, right? Like, that's not just, so all of these things are stacked on top of each other. We have to be able, even within our coalitions, to have tough conversations. It should not have been a surprise to the left that such a large percentage of Hispanic voters were going to show up the way they did. That, it came as a complete surprise. I wonder why. It shouldn't have, because there are so many immigrant rights organizations and Latino rights organizations at the table. But what wasn't the conversation that they weren't having within their own organizations they weren't having honest conversations within their own organizations. So part of it is, I would say, individually, we need to do some introspection.
Yeah.
Right? When we are working in allyship, we need to do some introspection, right? And how are we showing up, and how are we working with our partners? And then as a movement, we need to be having that same level of conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that, I want to get to you, Lawrence, about this question as well, but definitely with the non-voters, that was definitely on my list. I read a lot of people, about people who didn't vote, and I just had this conversation with some people about the fact that, I said, people are checking out of the process, right? It's and part of the reason is for one, if they're able to say, well, it doesn't really matter who's in office, I'm still getting screwed. And, or well, I have to go to work and my boss doesn't pay me if I have to go stand in line for 4 hours to go vote. That's a waste of my time. And like I said, my material conditions don't change. So you have people who are checking out. And so what's happening there? It would be really smart to go after those people. That's not actually what happened, right? It's and so I think that there is certainly a huge lesson in that. And so Lawrence, I'm going to go back to you with the same question that I posed.
Okay. So again, we could talk about this all night. The story comes to mind. So the story is told, can't say for sure, that Nixon JFK was tied before the election. And there was a choice about what to do with JFK because they heard that Dr. King was in the hospital, beaten up after a protest, I think. And so they made a phone call just to sort of check on him. That news leaked out. Black vote for JFK spiked. He wins the election. I think the Democratic Party has never forgotten that. They didn't have to give him any jobs. Didn't have to guarantee black folks anything. No appointments. No political infrastructure built for black folks. Just the appearance of caring. They thought was enough to push the election. So that's what we've been getting in terms of identity politics for the past 60 years from the Democratic Party. Nancy Pelosi kneeling in Kente clause, right? Because that does nothing to challenge the power of their donors, but you have a captured electorate because the nature of white supremacy has organized anti-black forces into the Republican Party. The problem is they thought that would work forever, and they thought that would work for every other group. Mm-hmm. So you see small but meaningful defections of black men towards Trump. Mostly you see folks just staying home. I think the Gaza stuff has something to do with that as well. But you also see that, for example, the Democratic Party, in my mind, had a choice between affirmative action with construction jobs. So you have folks like Perry Mitchell doing minority set-asides that shifted 10% of all the multi-billion-dollar federal investments in construction towards minority contractors. So that's political infrastructure. That's every year. The government spending anything, some of that's going to the pockets of black folks. Employing working-class black folk without college degrees, who many of our elders told us that those construction jobs kept people off the corners and kept people alive. And when you see that sort of political impact go away, because the Democratic Party stopped fighting for affirmative action in construction and marshaled their efforts more towards affirmative action in colleges, where elite, managerial, nonprofit Democrats could ensure access to jobs but would not have to deal with fighting for the redistribution of resources to Black folks. So when you want to understand the collapse in Black turnout, look at the fact that Black folks are looking around, stuff being built in their communities, but the people don't look like them. And shockingly enough, legal, documented citizen Latinx folks felt that undocumented folks were taking their jobs, right? So you have this collapse of the male Latinx votes and a lot of the female Latinx vote because there's an inability to focus on material redistribution of votes, right? And I think a lot of that got sucked up in the conversation about trans, right? Mm-hmm. And trans was deployed as a wedge issue, and that was narrated as patriarchy within the male community. I think that when the question was asked, it was asked something to the effect of, do you think Democrats spend too much time focusing on issues like trans and not enough time focusing on delivering for people like you? I think that that's actually an economic frame, not just an identity frame. Because what do people hear about? They hear about trans folks playing sports, and they hear about trans healthcare in schools. Mm-hmm. But if your school doesn't have a school nurse, it feels like something that's for elites. And that's where the conversation is like, they don't care about me, right? So in many ways, if you're delivering for people materially, they're not going to care what you think about trans people. But it's the sense of the inability to deliver materially allow trans to be a proxy for, are you committed to do it materially delivering for people like me? Culture is a context for commitment. So we have this identity politics argument outside of how it's actually being viewed by the people on the ground. It's a question of who you are committed to. You're committed to appearing to appease my identity issues without ever materially delivering. Because I don't hear people talking about trans healthcare. I don't hear people talking about trans housing. I don't hear people talking about trans mortality rates. They talk about the things they can do even for trans folks and do not materially redistribute resources to them. And he definitely don't talk about trans folk or Black queer folks controlling the infrastructure of how those resources are deployed. So at best, you got white saviors profiting off the trans issue the way they profit off every other issue, right? So I think that when you talk about identity politics, the move is going to be to say that's dead. Universalist policies, if anything, cash payments, stuff like that. And I think it's one of those things where increasingly the divide in politics is not as much left-right as it is top-bottom. We have a left that has adopted top-down managerial elite control as its vision of how we should organize society. So when you talk about funding nonprofits and do services for community, I can't vote out the head of the foundation. I can't vote out the head of the nonprofit. And so they go into the academy, other non-accountable institutions to get their methodologies for how they serve our community. Think about what I said about drug housing. And so when you think about potential solutions to this, think about what Kamala could have done if she would have said, so we're going to have legal cannabis nationwide. We're going to have a small tax on it. And that tax is going to be redistributed to communities impacted by the war on drugs. And I'm going to take on the opioid companies. I'm going to make them pay for what they did. And that's going to go to communities impacted by overdose, right? And in each of those communities, you're going to have the ability as a community to get those resources directly. You're not going to have to lobby in D.C. I'm going to send them to the communities themselves. And I'm going to trust you on the ground, whether you're in Cole County, Appalachia, or whether you're in Baltimore, Maryland, to pick for yourself how you want to self-determine your community to deal with the violence done to you. I don't think that would have triggered this crazy backlash, right? I think even something like, I think that would have created the context for people to see that they're invested in people like you having control over your own future. And I think this is what's missing from the Democratic Party. When we even did our, last thing I'll say, when we did our cannabis taxation policy, they wanted the money to stay in Annapolis. And they wanted like a panel of experts to decide where and when. It's like, no, we have the expertise. We have experience with the youth fund. We can do it. And what they said was interesting. They said, well, I don't trust the white folks, the racist white folks in the counties. I don't want them getting no money. You know what I mean? And it's like just how that framework of just not trusting people. Because, think about how many white folks have had like their families destroyed by like family separation and child welfare because of the addiction crisis. You think that they just love the police? You think defund the police is entirely toxic out there? I don't believe it. But if you actually engage people and understand what they're going through, I believe those folks know better than I do, certainly, what they need to repair their community to the damage done. But it's just this deep inability for the college-educated elite left that thinks that they've earned the right to rule through their credentials, through their elite status. That makes it very difficult for them to see whether it's for us, whether it's for poor white people, whether it's even for trans people, the ability of them themselves self-directing and self-determining their own agenda on these issues. And I think until the Democratic Party and the left, especially the left, because the left oftentimes thinks the best way for it to legitimate its redistributive policies is tied to elite academic consensus, and we actually know what's best. Until we grapple with that, we're going to be stuck in this tough dilemma.
All right.
To follow up on what Lawrence just said, I mean, it goes back to we know better,
Right.
right? And so I think Lawrence tapped in, like, a lot of this changes when we start organizing at the local level and building power at the local level and directing our leaders at the state level and the congressional level about what is important and what it is that we want to see in our communities.
So as we're getting, because we're at 7:10 now. For one, I wanted to see if anyone in the audience had any questions, because okay, so you can put your hand up if you do. And then I think I'm going to end with my ending question. I'm going to let you all know ahead of time. What does it actually look like? I think for people to organize. The elections are over. You know, I think that people are, after they kind of get through the anger and the sadness and all of that, what can they do to start organizing? What are the ways, whether it's tapping into mutual aid, you know, however folks can think about that. So I want to pose that question to you all. But Jacob, Tiffany?
Yeah.
All right.
So Andy and I will have to talk about later who the preferable opponent, Kamala or Trump, would have been. I would have much rather had an adversarial. I would rather organize against the Harris administration than a Trump administration, but we can take that later. You all brought so many thought-provoking things. I have questions for all three of you. I think the one that I want to come back to specifically with Charly, and then I'll try to be really quick, and then you all can decide. You brought up what can we do at the local level. You're talking about how to implement stuff. Mutual aid, you're bringing up different things. You were also talking about re-educating the public. I'm a civics and social studies teacher. I can start a reading group. I think we can all start reading groups. That's this kind of atomized thing. I don't think that that's going to battle the millions of people that are getting this information from Joe Rogan, the Manosphere, Daily Wire, any of these things. So, but what I would love to do is if there is some sort of infrastructure for basic civics education, right? How the three branches work, how that works at the local, city, state, and federal level, and how we can apply those pressure points. I would be really interested if you have any, if you know of ways that that's already being mobilized to try to do, whether mass media kind of, or even, it doesn't have to be mass media, but like local media, things that educators can get involved in, or yeah, somewhere where I don't have to start a new thing. I'm happy to do that, but if there's already stuff, I would rather not reinvent the wheel. And then I really want to say things to everybody, but I'm also curious about the Yale thing. What did that look like? How could we reproduce that with the Hopkins model? Yeah, is it a legislative thing? Is it a pressure campaign with a bunch of marches and consciousness awareness and then whatever, applying those pressure points? So those are the main ones. With the Lawrence thing, I'll just say, I don't have any grants that I could lose. I was born with a lot of identity politics sort of privileges, and I'm not working for tenure. So how could I be at the front face? Because my career is not on the line, but I would love to be in the work. So anybody who wants to deal with any of those three questions, they're such thought-provoking things. I want to just first thank you, and then whoever wants to start.
Who wants to start?
I'll start. New Haven Rising is a model that combined labor, community organizing, local politicians, and folks who weren't involved in any of those organizations. Jacob, I'll send you, I did a podcast with DeVarian Baldwin where he talks all about this and the lessons that it poses for other cities that have these big universities and the lessons that we have beyond that. So I will send that to you and we can look at it. You can look up DeVarian Baldwin, New Haven Rising. He is not the leader of that movement. He is an academic chronicler chronicler of that movement, and he understands his role in that as such. But it is a good example of a way that people, labor, progressive organizations, politicians, and workers came together in order to force a very powerful institution to redistribute some wealth and some power. It has limits, it has possibilities, but it is an example that we can look at to see ways that that type of thing can happen.
I would also add that there has been a move here in Baltimore to force to alter the pilot for Hopkins. So it is something that has to happen at the state level, and that is one way that people can plug in, right? I also have there are two civics organizations. There are two organizations, national organizations, that are devoted to teaching civics in schools, and I'm happy to talk to you about what they are after. But I think plugging in, if that was one of the questions, is that's something people can do right now, right? Because the legislative session is coming up, that they can push. The legislature needs to be pushed on this, and of course, Senate President is from Baltimore City. He has been reluctant to make any of those changes. He's been reluctant to pass any new revenue bills. For years here in Maryland, they pushed for revenue bills. The millionaire's tax was allowed to expire. Nobody in Annapolis is talking about, since the reshuffling, where a lot of the long-term progressives left, nobody is talking about progressive packages. But we need that more now than we ever did before because of the federal cuts that are coming down on education and other funding. That is something that people can start organizing to do. Also, is that this year we're to push our state legislature to pass some revenue measures, and including restructuring the pilot.
Yeah, and I mean, there was a local organization with us for us that came up last year that was working on some of this. I know that LBS was working on a progressive taxation bill that had a reparations component to it last year. There was also a bunch of unions working on a progressive taxation package last year. So this is going to be a conversation. And what happened last year was 40 Democrats and 40 unions signed on to it, and Westmore and Bill Ferguson went to the right in order to avoid giving Larry Hogan that as a talking issue in the Senate campaign, and I imagine they'll do that again this session with Larry Hogan's potential governor's campaign.
No, he just won't go. Like, give it a break.
Yeah,
Don't you have like a house to go to and chill? You people with money,
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question and to comment on that, part of the reason Hogan won, because people didn't want a third term of O'Malley. So people experienced Martin O'Malley treating the Democratic Party like its own mafia machine, right? Not in terms of illegal corruption per se, but in terms of how he treated people. So you go to folks like Jill Carter, who beyond her political ostracization, experienced deep, personal attacks as someone trying to stand up and talk about illegal arrests under the O'Malley regime. And the social pressure that produces is I will vote against the Democrats just to say F him, right? Because you actually going at one of my elders right now, right? So these are the types of things that I don't think people understand. It's people, it's even understanding that big political calculus for why he won in the first place, right? So I think it's one of those things where continue to be in spaces like this. I think we are going to reintroduce that reparations bill, having a diversity of folks there, plugged in, signed up for our email, so it's not just us. But part of the reason, and this is important, different people have competing interpretations of what progressive taxation should look like. A big part of what our bill does is try to lock some of that money into community-controlled containers and not put it in the general fund in a way that would be more amenable to some progressive groups. Because when you send a community self-determination as your core metric, you're going to come to different conclusions as to what that looks like. And what that has been narrated at historically is some people say, oh, you're fracturing the left. right? We should all be unified on a class basis. You want to have pots of money that Black communities control. It's going to lead some people to say, it should be for everybody. Everything should be for everybody. But we know everything's not for everybody, right? So these are the sort of questions and debates that typically we haven't had in public, and folks haven't had a context to understand the importance of our perspective. So I would say look into history, look into things like Walter Carter, the Model Cities programs, the community-controlled poverty programs, the beef Walter Carter had with William Donald Schaefer when he was trying to get permanently appointed to control that program, and Schaefer, pushed back against him, right? Look into Perry Mitchell, look into the Minority Set-Asides program. Like, all these things are things that have been excluded from progressive and leftist movements. They have been deemed irrelevant Black capitalism. They have been deemed as, frameworks for the Black bourgeoisie to lift itself up to the political process. And that, I think, again, tacit leftist anti-Blackness means that we can't even learn from those models, because that's what we're doing with the community reparations model, right? That's what we're doing with our visions of community control. That, again, the left is either ignorant of or, just kind of sees it. They don't know what to do with it a lot of the times. It doesn't create the enthusiasm, the commitment, the energy that other policies do, because people don't have a context to understand it. So I think that continuing to engage is important, because there's just so much going on, it is difficult to know. But going through the process can help build the groundwork for a more nuanced and, I think, effective negotiation of power.
So, were there any other questions from the audience? Any thoughts? Okay, one and then two. You go ahead, Jackie.
I'm so glad you centered things on power. And one of the questions that comes to me from the overall discussion is how much we still focus on the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that I've allowed myself to feel my anger, it's been more toward the Democratic Party, because they have, from my early lifetime, been on this path to allow this to happen. So I don't want to focus on it myself, but I'd like to know what you all think about, can you just ignore them and talk about our power and figure out how that's going to work? Is that possible? Is it? Why?
This is funny, because this is for almost 10 years, Andy and I have been having this sort of debate between ourselves. I think, at the time where I met Andy, I was building the Maryland Working Families Party. And in many places around the country, Working Families is an actual party. In New York, where it started, it's a party. They've been electing people, co-endorsing people. They have a fusion politics, different form of democracy there. My perspective is this. I think we need to get to a place where we have many different parties competing, because I think people will find their identity in those. I think it's going to take us a while to get there. Mm-hmm. So while people like Lawrence and Andy are working on building third parties, and I wholly support that, here in Maryland, it's pretty damn easy to take over the Democratic Party. Literally anywhere, it is easier to me to take over a party structure and not have to re-educate the entire public than it is to build. But we need to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? While we are building, we can't just say we're not going to engage. We have to still keep moving forward while, these guys are building the third, fourth, fifth parties that we can be part of. But if we look at the state legislature now, nearly 1/3 of the state of the Maryland General Assembly or the Maryland House of Delegates will have been appointed by a local central committee party. It takes less than $2,000 to win a seat on the local central committee. Their main role is to appoint vacancies. They're supposed to also be, and when I was young, this is what they did, is go out and talk to voters about the party to make it inclusive so that people felt like the party belonged to them. But now it's sort of like very insular and people only are worried about like, I have my power. And worse, you have elected leaders who are taking up seats so that they can consolidate power. But it doesn't take that much. If we wanted to control any of the House seats that are going to come up in Baltimore City, it wouldn't take that much to take over that party. And likewise, in any of the major counties of Maryland, I think that is an easier lift than creating third parties and having to re-educate people who've been sort of indoctrinated into a two-party system.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, I don't think that there is a liberal path out of what we have right now that involves the two-party system. I don't think that there is a liberal path out of Trumpism, out of fascism, that involves the two-party system. I'm not sure there's a liberal path out of it at all, but I'm pretty sure that there's not a liberal path out of it that involves the two-party system. So I believe in building that power outside of the two-party system, and I'm a Green who criticizes Greens who only attack the Democrats. I think there are a lot of Greens who only see the Democrats as the opponent, and I see the Republicans as an opponent. So when I'm running in 2025 and 2026, I want to recruit candidates all over the state. And I want to recruit candidates in those deep red counties the Democrats have sacrificed to the fascists because they think that they can carve out one part of it in order to be able to gerrymander their veto-proof majority. And so I want to have somebody run against Kathy Szeliga and Matt Morgan and some of the worst fascists in the right wing of the Maryland Democratic, or in the Maryland General Assembly. They don't have any power right now in the General Assembly because there's a veto-proof majority for the Democrats, but that doesn't mean they don't have power in their communities, and that doesn't mean that they don't have the power to define what is acceptable politics in the places that they live. So I want to make sure that we have working-class Greens challenging some of these folks in the Republican Party who are doing the awful things as well. And I think we need to challenge the Democratic Party, and I think that there's a cooperation that occurs to some degree there. People talk about pushing the Democratic Party to the left all the time, but as long as there's no force that is pulling the Democratic Party to the left, and there's no gravity of votes that is a consequence if the Democratic Party doesn't do what it's supposed to do, then pushing is only going to work as long as gravity lets you work, and until there's a pull of gravity outside of it, that push is only going to go so far. So yes, I don't disagree with anything that Charlie is saying. I think we need to walk and chew gum at the same time, and I think Democrats need to fix the Democratic Party, and I think people need to build power outside of the Democratic Party in order to challenge the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Can we do this in a world without parties? I don't know. I think parties are sort of an inherent aspect of our life, and if we pretend, or of our political life, and if we pretend they're not there, they're going to exert power in invisible ways. And so, like, I agree with you in some sense that we need to not just focus on the Democratic Party, and I agree with Charlie that reforming the Democratic Party and taking it over is an important thing, and I think the power built outside of the Democratic Party with rooted in justice, rooted in peace, rooted in democracy, and rooted in ecology can help us have a better world than the one that we have where the two parties set the tone and keep drifting further to the right.
Yeah. This is a weird example. I hope it lands. I think about this in the terms of there's this story that hip-hop was created after the riots in New York because they stole all the boomboxes. No one had boomboxes before then. I heard someone say, that's not true. You can have a boombox, but then you have the muscle to keep it. If someone wants a boombox, they can just take it off. So even in terms of state central committees, you can organize there, and the question is, do you have the muscle the trust in the community to keep it. Because look what happened in the 41st district when there was a battle when Howard Freeman, the former leader of AIPAC, and Yitzi Schleifer organized a slate of Jewish and Orthodox Jewish folks to take over that state central committee. So there actually had to be a counter slate organized in order to make sure they didn't have the ability to appoint people if someone stepped down. So again, we have this whole battle between, black folks and Zionists in our local politics that we don't even know about. And that's a question of muscle, right? And I think these are the battles that, when you're serious about organizing people to win, these are the battles that you strategize and theorize about. Because again, it's like, in African cultures, they have, sometimes called diunital conceptions. And I think this is a diunital reality, where it's like, because I think showing the Democrats that they don't have my vote is useful, I doubt, as long as I live in Maryland, I'm ever going to vote for a Democrat for president. But I'll probably organize, definitely really hard in primaries, when it's useful. When I have a candidate that I think is actually going to invest in my interests. And we have to constantly be broadening the scope of our people beyond what the Democratic Party allows them to see. So whether that is a third party, and I think, again, a gubernatorial run, and what is likely to be a close race, that's going to stir a lot of emotions, but that's going to be leverage. And the question is, how can we utilize that leverage to get what we need? Baltimore doesn't have the Baltimore region, I don't think, has a birthing center. All this talk about running on reproductive rights and the reproductive justice front was missing from that campaign. That's what happens when you don't have the muscle to force someone to engage your interests. So it's like, if Angela's not going to do it, all right, let me get West to do it. And if West don't do it, I'm going to tell people to vote green. I can't not have a birthing center. That's ridiculous. So these are the types of realities we have to organize and educate our people to make that not look crazy. It's more crazy that they don't give us a birthing center that I would vote green for them not doing it. But that's a question of organizing and getting the muscle to have the leverage to be able to do that. Last thing I'll say is, again, de-ideologizing our relationship to electeds in office. Because these folks are overworked, they're ignorant, not in a pejorative way. Literally, they cannot know enough about all the issues that come across their desk, right? So to see that ignorance not as an affront, but just as an inevitable reality of the way the world is structured, and to see it as an opportunity, if you have the muscle to get them to listen to you, to be able to serve as an auxiliary to them, to design policies for them. They just want stuff that works. And if you have policies that work and the muscle to help them sell it, they can be useful. But if you ideologically see their inability to do it themselves as a betrayal of your community, you're going to say, why would I ever do that? And if you ideologically see their position, connection to a Democratic Party that supports things like genocide in Gaza, that supports things that I can't vouch for, as a reason to completely disengage, then we have lost the ability to flex our muscle in ways that could actually deliver materially for our people. So when we talk about the art and science and the nation management skill of engaging power, these are the sort of things that have been brought to us from many reformist, problematic traditions, but also through the Black radical tradition. And I think it's been our inability to see those skills as an extension of a Black radical tradition that has left so many of us so disconnected from politics of someone like Trump.
I think it was one last person, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. I just want to say that one important thing to get people engaged is to have an issue that is simple to understand and that has an effect on you, right? So that's why question H was such a good mobilizing opportunity, because you had a villain, you had a face, you knew what you wanted to get, you knew what you were trying to get, and you knew that we didn't like it, right? So that's why so many people got together in this amazing coalition that defeated it so decisively and so convincingly, right? And I think that the next villain could be Hopkins, because Hopkins is the biggest employer in the city, huge amounts of money. They really do not pay them. I think they pay nothing, right? And there is a lot of disaffection even within the Hopkins community, among the faculty and among the students, that can be leveraged. And I look forward to some kind of organizing around that. I mean, I don't know who will spearhead it, but I can see many people coming together on that. And that would be a great way to get people engaged in politics that have to end there, right?
Yeah.
And finally, my last point is, I mean, they're trying to decipher what happened and why Harris lost. I mean, I think I would like, that all of you gave good reasons, but I would like to amplify Lawrence's explanation that many people who would have voted for her just did not feel heard. And I'm not talking about the men and all that, I'm talking about purely economic people who really feel like this economy is not working for them, and who after 8 years of Obama still did not see the economy working for them. And then after 4 years of Biden, still do not see the economy working for them, even though the Dow is doing great. And the Nasdaq too, the Nasdaq is doing really well. So, and Trump, because he's a narcissist, knew that that was the way to connect with them. Does he mean it? Of course he doesn't, but he connected.
Yeah. I think that there were a lot of things that I'll be probably thinking about for the next, whoever knows how long from this conversation. One of the things I will say that I've been just trying to remember is just that honestly, y'all, all we have is each other. Party, no party. Like, I have been thinking a lot about what this means just going forward for the country. What does it mean for my community? What does it mean for my friends and my family? Those who are even more marginalized than myself. And, making sure that you are building community where you're at. And when I say that, that does not mean that you need to lead the community. Because, thinking of power, I think that a lot of people, they want to be the leader. Mm-hmm. They want to have something to put on their resume or put on their Instagram. And that's all well and fine. I mean, granted, I wouldn't be doing that during authoritarian kind of thing. I wouldn't put my stuff on social media. But I mean, if you do, you got it. But I think truly building to build as a community and build a collective, it means taking, I think, a lot of ego out. And so ego is, I think, another huge thing that a lot of us are going to have to let go of, and that we'll probably learn to let go of. Because I think that Trump and his friends have enough ego for all of us. So I want to thank you all for coming to the 13th, or the November 13th of the month event. We are really, really excited to have these in person again, because we've been online for so long. But I really do hope that you all took something from these three wonderful, wonderful people. I want to thank you.
Thanks for viewing this BRJA 13th of the month event. For more information about BRJA and to sign up for our mailing list, please visit our website at bemoreantiracist.org. Thanks for viewing this BRJA 13th of the month event. For more information about BRJA and to sign up for our mailing list, please visit our website at bemoreantiracist.org.